Our second speaker is Dr. Stefan Irig. Stefan Irig is a historian for European and Middle Eastern history, working especially on entangled and transnational aspects. Besides a book on post-Soviet Moldova in German, his recent books include Ataturk in the Nazi Imagination, which was published at Harvard University Press in 2014, and Justifying Genocide, Germany and the Armenians from Bismarck to Hitler, which will be published by Harvard University Press as well in this coming January 2016. Well done. Dr. Irig's lecture title is The Armenian Genocide and the World Around It from 1915 to 1923. His paper will draw on his research for the book on Germany and the Armenians. We'll look at how the Armenian genocide impacted the world around it, mostly in a chronological sense, focusing on World War I and then also Germany. Please go ahead, Stefan.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to talk to you, to be able to talk to you today on this topic. What I'm going to talk about is drawn from my research on Germany and the Armenian genocide, but I think it fits in nicely with what Mark Sherman just presented for the American case. And before I come to this German angle, let me state something more general. In my opinion, this now 100-year-old conflict between those denying and those calling for recognition of the Armenian genocide had one remarkable and rather appalling result. It has left the Armenian genocide in a historical limbo. It hovers there, apparently unresolved outside world history, or rather is still neither totally integrated into the horrible history of the 20th century, nor given its deserved role in general. You probably all know general accounts of the First World War often do not really include the Armenian genocide, and also the same is true for national histories, for example, also German history. There's this idea that the Armenian genocide, for example, is distant both in time and space when it comes to developments in Germany after World War I. In any case, this letting the Armenian genocide stay in this historical limbo, I think, is very shocking also, as it is, I would argue, the original crime of the 20th century. If you look at the 20th century in its short form from 1914 to 1989 or 91. But, as I can illustrate for the German case, the Armenian genocide had a huge impact on the world around it, and I'm going to give you some examples from the German case today. It had immense repercussions and influence on the evolution of discourse and thought about humanitarianism, atrocities, as well as the language and the perception of genocide. What do I mean when I say the perception of genocide? Let us go 25 years into the future from 1915. The Holocaust is in progress, and the news coming from Europe suffer from something you could call a publicity problem. Despite you having news reaching the West, politicians and journalists, the result was disbelief. Disbelief is on the one hand a normal aspect of genocide and atrocities in progress. It is always or often hard to imagine and believe the reality of genocide as it happens. On the other hand, there was some specific dimension of disbelief when the Holocaust was happening, and this was also the result of World War I and of the Armenian genocide. World War I was not only a horrible war on a global scale, it was also one in which atrocity allegations played a very central role in the propaganda battle between the enemy nations. Many researchers on this topic stress this dimension as also something new, something important for understanding the war, and something that further contributed to the radicalization of it. In a way, the Armenian genocide was, as it happened in 1915 and 16, just one of a whole gruesome series of atrocity allegations. There were the alleged atrocities carried out by the Germans in Belgium, deportations and anti-Jewish measures in Russia, submarine warfare, bombardment of open cities and hospitals. In this context, perhaps the Armenian genocide, or rather the allegations by the Entente to that end, was just one of many propaganda topics. This hurt and hindered the case of recognition and of giving the Armenian genocide its place in world history to an incredible fashion. It also made it harder during the next World War to recognize the Holocaust as it happened. Most records of the time, the 1940s, do not mention the Armenian genocide as directly, but what they do mention and reflect is the fear that all these news reaching the West from the Nazi killing grounds and later about Auschwitz particularly too, were just the newest form of otherwise either baseless or wildly exaggerated atrocity allegations, just as it had happened during World War I, so many people thought. If I now said that the Armenian genocide was one of many atrocity allegations and topics during World War I, at the same time, it was also something very different. On the one hand, the allegations against the Ottomans were both more believable than the other allegations, the image of the barbarian Turk being present in many Western culture, vis-à-vis the so-called cultured German and what had happened in Belgium. And on the other hand, the allegations against the Ottoman were also almost unbelievable in scope. A whole population targeted for punitive measures in the language of the time that included but was not limited to deportation. And already in June 1915, the Entente reacted to the news about wholesale massacres and the deportations in their statement of warning to the Ottomans. And now let's take this Entente warning and go actually to Germany and how it received it. I don't know how well you know this warning of June 1915, but this Entente declaration was reprinted in a couple of German newspapers, often on the front page. I'm going to quote it. It's a little bit long, but I think it's important to get an idea how and that indeed it was received at the time. So this Entente declaration, now taken from the German newspapers, read as follows, quote, "For approximately 1 month now, the Turkish and Kurdish population of Armenia, meaning the geographical region, has been carrying out mass murders among the Armenians with the acquiescence and often with the support of the Ottoman authorities. In the middle of April, such instances of mass murder took place in Erzurum, Terjan, Eguin, and it goes on to list a whole series of localities." I continue. "The inhabitants of about 100 villages in the vicinity of Van have all been murdered, and the Armenian quarter has been besieged by the Kurds. At the same time, the Ottoman government went on a rampage against the defenseless Armenian population of Constantinople. In view of this new crime against humanity and civilization, the Allied governments are publicly announcing to the Sublime Porte that they will personally hold responsible all members of the Turkish government as well as its subsidiaries who are taking part in such mass murders." End of quote. Now it's important, I think, to understand when it comes to Germany, and actually I would argue that Germany is important in this context because Germany, of course, was in a different position than the Entente countries or the still neutral United States, because it could have intervened to some extent for the Armenians. It's also important, to look at these, how these ongoing atrocity, how the genocide was perceived in Germany, because Germany had a long tradition of coming to terms with violence against the Ottoman Armenians. It's perhaps a matter for another talk, but let us just underline here that as a result of a specific German relationship with the Ottoman Empire, Germany had already become, in the 1890s, during the Hamidian massacres, a battleground between pro- and anti-Armenian voices. During World War I, the pro-Armenian voices were all but silenced in the name of wartime censorship and propaganda. But now, as it needs to be stressed, wartime censorship did not mean that Germany did not talk about the Armenians. It meant simply that only pro-Ottoman voices were allowed to talk and to be printed in the German press. So the Entente Declaration of June 1915 was used as a chance to slander the Armenians. The declaration, the Entente Declaration that I just quoted, was put under headlines such as an Armenian conspiracy or an Armenian revolution. And this is what happened in German wartime public discourse, which was solely characterized by pro-Ottoman voices. Pro-Ottoman being a bit of a euphemism here, because this wartime discourse now had to, and actually did, justify whatever the Ottomans were doing to the Armenians. The sheer existence of violence on a genocidal scope during the war, and the sheer fact that it had entered into World War I atrocity propaganda in the propaganda battle, led to an incredible radicalization of German discourse on minorities and atrocities in general, as well as on the Armenians specifically. A radicalization of discourse when it comes to war and civilian populations in war, which was also visible, by the way, perhaps, when it comes to German propaganda around the Holy War, the Jihad, during World War I. After the June Entente warning, the next occasion for the German press to act as a shield for the Ottomans, as it had done in the 1890s, and to justify what was in fact genocide in progress, was later in October, when some of the British lords in the House of Lords discussed again allegations against both the Ottomans and the Germans. Again, German newspapers took the propaganda bait and shouted justifications for violence, perpetuated the image of an Armenian stab in the back, and called on the Turks not to be intimidated by the Entente propaganda and continue with whatever they were doing. This continued until the rest of the war, the German press justifying whatever the Turks were doing and reacting to Entente propaganda, although it became a little bit more quiet after 1916. And then, especially important, I think, is what happens after the war. And Mark Sherman, if you remember his list, the quantity of newspapers from the different years, there was also a significant rise of newspaper articles in the time directly after the war. I'm looking here at the time from 1919 to 1923, and I would claim that what took place in Germany has to be called a great genocide debate. Let me, in the following, sketch this only briefly. First discussing why it was a great genocide debate, why it was a German genocide debate, and finally why it was at all a genocide debate. We don't have enough research, I think, to make them definitive comparative statements, but it appears, and I'm pretty sure, that it was the largest genocide debate to date in recorded history, in fact. It started in the aftermath of World War I, slowly with various pro-Armenian activists publishing articles and giving lectures about what had happened during the war. There was almost no response at first. Germany was preoccupied with a lot of other things. It was only the fusion of particular German issues with the Armenian topic that created an early high point already in the summer of 1919 of this debate. The German Foreign Office feared that allegations of German co-responsibility for the Armenian genocide would be used against Germany at the Paris Peace Treaty negotiations. And in sort of a preemptive strike, it asked Johannes Lepsius, a very prominent pro-Armenian activist, to edit documents from the archives of the Foreign Office on the Armenian genocide. And this edition already was published in the summer of 1919, only a few months after the end of World War I. The goal, of course, was to favorably influence the Entente and the world, yet in the end, it only created much awareness of the genocide and the first debate in Germany itself. So in the summer of 1919 and early autumn 1919, one could read long essays condemning what had happened to the Armenians in the German press, enhanced with very specific and very graphic details of the genocide. The publication of the Foreign Office not only led to a debate, but also to a broad acceptance of genocide in the terms of the time, similar terms as Mark has shown here, the extermination of the Armenians, the murder of the Armenian people, and so on. A broad acceptance of genocide against the Armenians by the German newspaper public. The pro-Ottoman voices had at first abstained from the debate. However, after a few weeks, they caught their breath and began a denialist campaign. And like so often in the history of this topic in German public debates, a strong backlash followed. In this case, a long year of backlash from late 1919 until early 1921. With surprising energy and stamina, the anti-Armenian side continued to publish articles and essays putting the blame on the Armenians, perpetuating the Armenian stab in the back myth, and denying the extent and intent of genocide. And then came, in March 1921, the assassination of Talat Pasha, former Minister of the Interior and Grand Vizier in Berlin. A trial, highly publicized, followed in the summer of 1921 in Berlin as well. This trial and the media coverage were another high point of this German genocide debate, and now it led to an even broader acceptance of genocide as fact across the board in German newspapers. And now this included formerly denialist newspapers as well. So strong was the mood that these papers had no other choice to accept the facts of genocide in 1921. But then this produced another backlash campaign, which now resulted in these formerly denialist papers openly justifying genocide, and not only in the Armenian case, but also more general as a policy measure. The debate only came to a conclusion with the Treaty of Lausanne, in which Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish nationalists revised the Treaty of Sèvres in 1923. This debate was also a German debate, because not only drew it on German traditions, perceiving the Armenians as the Jews of the Orient, but when another assassination of young Turk leaders in Berlin in the spring of 1922 sparked a renewed debate about the Armenians and the Armenian genocide. Now, in early 1922, it was directly linked to calls for a solution of the Jewish and the immigrant questions in Germany. And finally, it was a debate about genocide. It was a debate about the extent and intent of genocide, about all the gory details of genocide, about its implications, repercussions, and finally also about possible justifications for genocide. Now I could say a lot more about the connection we could draw from 1923 onwards in German history, and I would call for caution to jump all too easily from this to Hitler and what happened later. However, just to make a short point on this, it has to be stressed that the Nazis were there in the early 1920s. They were there as newspaper readers, of course, and also as, please use quotation marks, as political thinkers. In my book about the Nazis and Ataturk, I made a point about the origins of this Nazi fascination with Ataturk and the New Turkey in relation to the early 1920s. I stressed there that because of the media hype, around the Turkish War of Independence, which is concurrent also with these years, 1919 to 1923, the Nazis as a political movement grew up with Turkey and Mustafa Kemal, and Mustafa Kemal's war revising a Paris peace treaty. A similar point, one adding to it, but in a way parallel, because these are two different topics, has to be made here. The Nazis also grew up with the German debates around the Armenian genocide. They could not have missed it. I don't want to hog the time from the next speaker, but I could present you some details now about how the Turkish example was discussed in the Nazi press at this time. Just give you one short example. There was a huge series of articles on what made the success of the revisionists and the nationalists in Turkey possible in these years. And one of these articles, actually a very prominent series of articles, stressed 3 points as lessons for Germany. One of the lessons was a united front under a strong leader. The next one was an army of volunteers. And finally, it was all about getting rid of the minorities. Now, it's easy for us as historians to project back how these words and how such articles could have, what kind of power or what kind of influence they could have had on the readers. But actually, for these articles in the Nazi papers, we do have a documented reaction. A German Jewish writer by the name of Siegfried Lichtenstädter commented on this specific article, calling for Turkish solutions for Germany, in his book Antisemitica in 1926, where, as you can tell by the title, he discusses the mood of the time and such articles. And he said these lessons formulated for Germany from Turkey meant that the Jews of Germany and Austria should and had to be killed and their property given to Aryans. This is an impression from the time. There would be much more to say. Let me just say, the Armenian genocide unfolded such debates and had such an influence of the time around it that we have to integrate it into wider world, European and also German history. Not to jump to easy conclusions here, but it is something we have to keep in mind when we think about politics in the 1920s and 30s. Thank you very much.